Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now in our second season and more excited than ever to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. We look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show on Earth Month 2021, Restoring Our Earth. And today we're going to be talking about restoration and mitigation as it relates to biodiversity, extinctions, and our health. Nature is declining globally at rates that are unprecedented in human history, and the rates of species extinctions is accelerating with very grave impacts on people around the world, now likely, warns a landmark report from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which was approved at the UN's Paris Climate Summit in 2019. The overwhelming evidence of that global assessment report from a wide range of different fields of knowledge presents a very ominous picture. The report tells us that it's not too late, however, to make a difference, but only if we start now at every level, from global to local. And it tells us that through transformative change, nature can still be conserved, restored, and used sustainably. And this is also the key to meeting most of the other global goals that the UN has identified. By transformative change, though, we mean a fundamental system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, and social factors, including various paradigms, goals, and values. The member states of this UN plenary group have now acknowledged that by its very nature, transformative change can expect a great deal of opposition. Opposition from those interests that are vested in the status quo, but also that such opposition can be overcome from the broader public good, the report states. And biodiversity and nature's contributions to people are our common heritage and they're humanity's most important life-supporting safety net. But our safety net is stretched a lot, almost to the breaking point, says Professor Sandra Diaz, who actually co-chaired this assessment report. The diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems, as well as many fundamental contributions we derive from nature, are declining fast, although we still have the means at this point to ensure a sustainable future for people and the planet if we're intentional about it. This is a lot, but we're going to unpack it today. And here to start us out is Tierra Curry. Tierra is a senior scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity, where she leads the Saving Life on Earth campaign to end the global extinction crisis. Tierra works nationally with individuals and groups in support of celebrating and protecting biodiversity. Prior to joining the Center for Biological Diversity in 2007, Tierra worked as an amphibian field biologist. She enjoys non-intrusively spying on wildlife, reveling with others about the beauty and the wonder of nature. The Center for Biological Diversity is a global nonprofit that believes that the welfare of human beings is deeply linked to nature, to the existence in our world of a vast diversity of wild animals and plants. The center believes that its loss impoverishes society, and they work to secure a future for all species, great and small, hovering on the brink of extinction. And they do this through science, through law, and creative media with a focus on protecting the lands, waters, and climate that the species need to survive. Welcome, Tierra. We're so glad that you could join us today.
Thanks so much, Bernice. It's an honor to be here.
Tierra, I want you to start us off by telling us what was the impetus for the creation of the Center for Biological Diversity, and define what you all mean and what you're talking about when you say biological diversity.
Sure. So the center was founded back in 1989, which is the same year Taylor Swift was born.
All right.
For some pop culture reference there. The center was founded by a group of biologists who were out surveying for Mexican spotted owls in the Southwest. That was a protected species. And they found some of the spotted owl nest. And so they went and reported it to their supervisor because that area was slated to be logged, and it wasn't supposed to be logged with the owls there. And the Forest Service was going to move forward with the logging project anyway, even though they weren't supposed to. And so they went to the local newspaper, and they became the Southwest Center for Biological Diversity, which over the years has grown, and now we're the Center for Biological Diversity, and we work around the country and in Mexico and in a couple of other countries, just trying to protect biodiversity. And what we mean by that is all the different kinds of plants and animals and other organisms that we share the planet with. Because like you said, we think that human well-being is deeply linked to the well-being of wildlife, and that, you know, we're a part of nature, but our not just physical well-being, but our emotional, psychological, spiritual well-being depends on the health of the planet and all these other plants and animals, the ones that we know about and the ones that most people have never even heard of as well.
Indeed. And I noticed that you all do this, you drive with science, because I noticed you have a lot of scientists working at the center.
Absolutely. And the science, you know, science is what shows us that wildlife is declining and the importance of the wildlife, but really it's about capturing people's hearts, which I love your show because that's what you're doing. You're trying to take that science and capture people's hearts and say, hey, look, like the health of the bumblebees reflects the health of the humans, and we all need to do a better job of taking care of nature.
Could you give us a good example of why people should care about biological diversity? Because like so many other areas of environmental issues and impacts, there's a tendency to think it's far from us. So if you can give an example that perhaps everybody can identify with, that shows them why just ordinary people walking in the street should care about biological diversity.
Absolutely. So, I mean, human well-being is dependent on the ecosystem services that nature and the planet provide. And so that's things like water filtration, where freshwater mussels filter the water to make it clean for us, or wetlands and forests providing flood control, to carbon storage and climate stability, like the tundra, seagrass, mangroves, marshes, deserts, grasslands, all the different ecosystem types store vast amounts of carbon that help stabilize the climate to keep us healthy. And then there's things like pollination. Like 1 out of every 5 bites of food that we take is dependent on pollinators, bumblebees and butterflies and native bees. And then you have all of the different foods and medicines that we take and we eat and the ones we haven't discovered yet. All of those come from nature as well. Something as specific as earthworms or terrestrial snails making healthy soil so that we can grow food, or trees, you know, expelling oxygen so that we can breathe. Our well-being is dependent on all of those wildlife and plants being able to do their thing.
What about honey? Isn't bees making honey a very succinct ecosystem service?
Yeah, that's a specific product, and that's actually, you could do a whole show about that.
But to realize without nature providing its ecosystem services, there would be no honey.
Absolutely. Fruits and vegetables, blueberries, like all of our crops have to be pollinated. So native bees provide a lot of pollination services as well as the honeybees, but a lot of our fruit crops have to be pollinated for them to produce fruit.
So if all the bees were wiped off the total earth, we would have no honey, we would not have any strawberries, and no blueberries and a lot of other things, right?
Right, and bees aren't even the only animals that pollinate. Bats also pollinate, and butterflies are pollinators as well.
And what do the butterflies pollinate? What is the end result, the thing that we know and see in our everyday life that butterflies doing their services provide for us?
So, like the monarch butterfly is found in the 48 connected states, and it flies across the entire continent, and it nectars. The adult butterflies nectar on more than 100 different flowers. So it's playing some sort of role in pollination at a continental scale, but it's not something that scientists have studied very much yet, because even though it's not the best food pollinator, it's sort of an iconic pollinator that's an umbrella for the plight of all the pollinators. And monarchs have declined by 85% because of pesticide use and development sprawl, climate change. So their plight reflects the plight of the larger pollinator community, which reflects back in the food security of humans.
Indeed. We're going to go to break now, Tierra, and I want to come back because I want to make sure people understand what these ecosystem services are that these small animals provide for us. We'll be right back on the other side of the break with Tierra Curry with the Center for Biological Diversity. She's a senior scientist there. Thank you. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV service. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas community. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening, plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, non-mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio as we continue our conversation with Tierra Curry, a senior scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity. And Tierra was giving us a primer, so to speak, on ecosystem services, telling us about the very important things that many of the small animals or insects in our community do, and these things we take for granted every day, like bees producing honey and many other insects that pollinate a lot of the fruits like strawberries, raspberries, and blueberries. So thank you for helping us out with this, Tierra. Tierra, in your work at the Center for Biological Diversity, you focus on building a movement to end extinction. So will you tell us about what things or what species are most imminently facing extinction, and what the extinction of these things or these species will mean to life on Earth or will mean to human health?
You know, a couple of decades ago, if you had asked me what species was most facing extinction, I would have said amphibians. Like frogs and salamanders are very threatened because of pesticides and climate change and disease and ozone depletion. But in the ensuing decades, so many more things are moving to the front of the extinction crisis. And so that report you were talking about earlier, the UN report, says that 1 million species are now at risk of extinction. And there's a group of groups, it's like a macro group called the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So they put out these quarterly assessments, and their most recent assessment says that 1 out of 4 species is now facing extinction. And so in the United States, the leading edge of that is freshwater species. We've already lost 71 species of freshwater snails to extinction. We've lost 38 species of freshwater mussels. And a lot of these are animals most people have never heard of. But to go back to ecosystem services, freshwater mussels filter water for us while we're sleeping. So while they're just down on the bottom of rivers breathing and feeding, they're making the rivers cleaner for us. And their shells also help stabilize the riverbanks and play a role in flood control. And other animals use their shells once the mussels die, like crawdads and little fish and all sorts of insects. live on or in those mussel shells. And so most people have never heard of them, but basically they work for us 24/7. And they're interesting in their own right. The southeastern United States has almost 300 species of freshwater mussels, which makes it a global hotspot for their diversity. So they're kind of the leading edge of the extinction crisis in the U.S., but other species are also in a lot of trouble. A report came out today showing that bats have been decimated by white nose syndrome. And bats are also really important for humans because they eat mosquitoes and they eat agricultural pests. And they also, so bat poop or guano plays a really important role in cave ecosystems. It's like a source of nutrients that supports the fish and the crayfish and the insects that live in the caves. And so everything is just really connected. And now that all of these groups are so threatened, we're in the throes of an extinction crisis now. And at the center, we think that extinction is a political choice, and we could make a different political choice. So we really need everyone to put pressure on their representatives and elected officials to fight extinction, like at a local level and a national level and an international level.
Let me ask you this. Are there any other species that are on the verge of extinction that people might more readily know about or more readily come in direct contact with?
Absolutely. Monarch butterflies are a species that were once super widespread and familiar. They're the large orange and black butterflies that a lot of people watched metamorphose in classrooms. In the western United States, monarchs have declined by 99%. There were fewer than 2,000 overwintering monarchs on the coast of California this winter, and that's down from 1.2 million a couple of decades ago. And bumblebees are in the same boat. There's a species called the American bumblebee. It's declined by 90%. And out on the West Coast, there's a species called Franklin's bumblebee that hasn't been seen since 2006. It lived in California and Oregon, and it's likely extinct now. There's a species from Australia called the bramblecay melames. It was declared extinct in 2019, and it was the first mammal to be declared extinct because of climate change impacts alone. And so although most Americans probably never got to see it, probably can't see it now because it's extinct, losing a mammal to extinction just because of climate change, because of sea level rise, is really a wake-up call because humans are mammals. And so it just drives home that we have to fight climate change to prevent extinction of animals around the world and in the United States.
Indeed. But going back to extinction, is there anything else, again, that we may come in contact with? I know, certain tigers are going extinct. Not that we come in contact with them every day, but we like to know that they're at zoos and that we can go somewhere to see them. Are there perhaps any everyday insects that may be on the verge of extinction that most people will have seen or known about?
Absolutely. Scientists estimate that from 10 to 40% of all insects are now at risk of extinction. So that includes butterflies and bees, but also fireflies or lightning bugs. A lot of us grew up on the East Coast chasing lightning bugs. Lightning bugs are in trouble now. And just frogs and bats, things that we used to take for granted that they would be there. They call it shifting baseline. Today's kids don't have that experience of frogs singing at night or lightning bugs blinking or bats flying through the yard.
While these species are on the verge but may not yet be extinct, they are decreasing, I gather, and if we don't do something, they're going to be. What is the impact of these species dwindling or decreasing now?
So also, in terms of ecosystem services, like the 38 species of freshwater mussels that we've lost, that makes water filtration more expensive for cities, losing those native mussels. Losing pollinators makes growing food more difficult. Losing frogs and bats means there's more mosquitoes, means there's more diseases. So those directly impact humans. But there's also the emotional and psychological cost of knowing that wildlife is at risk around the planet now because of the choices that we're making, and that we have the responsibility to make a different choice to protect wildlife so that we don't lose a million species.
How do y'all get that message over in your program? Because I know that I report a lot on the efforts with monarchs, but then when I have some conversations with ordinary people, they don't see the importance of it don't understand it. So in the program that you lead, how are you getting that message over?
So that we do lots of creative media projects. Like before the shutdowns, we were going around the country working with artists, putting up murals of endangered species in the communities where they're found. So like in Birmingham, we did a watercress darter. In Austin, we did the salamanders. In Oakland, we did grizzly bears, which aren't found there anymore, but they're still on the California flag. Just so that like when people go by those murals, they'll think about the species, and then maybe the species can become a source of community pride. Like in Knoxville, Tennessee, we did a freshwater mussel mural because the Tennessee River has so many species of mussels that most people don't know about. So maybe they'll see the mural and be like, wow, that's really cool. I didn't know that that's part of what made this place so special.
Tierra, can you tell us about any species that has actually gone extinct or that has been recently declared extinct?
Yeah, so Australia lost the bramble melames in 2019 because of climate change. The Franklin's bumblebee was last seen in 2006 in Oregon. We've lost 38 species of freshwater mussels. Most recently, the Coosa pigtoe from Georgia. It was last seen in 2002. In the last couple of years, 2 spring snails were declared extinct, the beaver pond marstonia in Georgia and the Ozark purge in the Ozarks. But the part of that story is that, like, the World Wildlife Fund Living Planet Index says that vertebrate populations around the globe have declined by 60% on average. So these declines in wildlife species sort of tell the story of all of the species that are booming, that extinction is booming for if we don't change.
What's driving those extinctions you just talked about?
So E.O. Wilson, the biologist, says you can use the acronym HIPPO to capture the drivers of extinction, and that's habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, overexploitation, and just, human population growth and us choosing to live unsustainably.
Indeed. So, Tierra, we just have about a minute before we go. And talk to us just a little bit about the connection between extinction and environmental justice, and how does this also affect people who may not be in the vulnerable classes? In other words, why should everyone care?
That is an excellent question, and one we could talk about for so long, but the factors that are driving extinction are the same factors that are driving a lot of environmental justice issues with fossil fuel extraction, toxins, pesticides. Like in Appalachia, mountaintop removal coal mining threatens a lot of freshwater species with extinction. It also has increased incidence of cancer and heart disease for the residents. Or in Louisiana, we're fighting the Formosa plastics plant, which is going to go in Cancer Alley, where the residents are already disproportionately affected by pollution, and it's being driven by the fossil fuel industry. So the drivers of injustice are shared, and the solutions are shared as well, as we fight for the health of the people in those communities, and we fight to save the species that are going to be impacted by those toxins.
Indeed. We really appreciate your help and you making us smarter in terms of all the scientific ins and outs of biodiversity and extinction, Tierra. We thank you very much, and we'd love to have you back because, as you said, this is something that can use a lot more time to get that ordinary person to understand how it affects their everyday life. And I think that's a big challenge, but I think you guys are really taking it on in some creative ways. Thank you so much. We've been with Tierra Curry with the Center for Biological Diversity, and we are going to go to break. And after the break, we will go on to part 2 of our show and talk about biodiversity, extinctions, and our health from the health perspective with Dr. Erin Bernstein. Thank you, Tierra. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We're on part 2 of our show, Earth Day, or Earth Month 2021, Restoring Our Earth. And today we're talking about restoration and mitigation, biodiversity, extinctions, and our health. And in this part of our show, we're going to look at the health perspective. Healthy communities rely on well-functioning environments around them, and that's usually called an ecosystem. They provide clean air, fresh water, medicines, and food security. Those well-functioning environments also limit disease and stabilize the climate. But biodiversity loss is happening at an unprecedented rate, and that's impacting human health worldwide, according to a State of Knowledge report jointly published by the Convention on Biological Diversity and the World Health Organization. Biodiversity underpins all of life on Earth, and it refers basically to biological variety in all its forms, from the genetic makeup of plants and animals all the way to cultural diversity. People depend on biodiversity in their daily lives in ways that are not always apparent or appreciated. Human health ultimately depends upon ecosystem products and services, such as the availability of fresh water, food, and fuel services, which are requisite for good human health and productive livelihoods. Biodiversity loss can have significant direct human health impacts if the ecosystem services are no longer adequate to meet social needs, and indirectly, changes in ecosystem services affects livelihoods, it affects incomes, it affects local migration, and on occasion, it can even cause or exacerbate political conflict, like we're seeing in our own country and a lot of other countries via the immigration crises. And there's growing concern about the health consequences of our biodiversity loss. Biodiversity changes affect ecosystem functioning, and significant disruptions of ecosystems can result in life-sustaining ecosystem goods and services being hindered. Biodiversity loss also means that we're losing, before discovery, many of nature's chemicals and genes of the kind that have already provided humankind with enormous health benefits. Now, this is a lot, but we need to understand it a lot more. And here today to help us unpack some of this is Dr. Bernstein, MD. Aaron is the interim director of the Center for Climate, Health, and the Global Environment at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, called Harvard Chan Sea Change. He is a pediatrician at Boston Children's Hospital and an assistant professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Bernstein focuses on the health impacts of the climate crisis on children's health. He leads an organization or effort called Climate MD, and that's a Harvard Chan Sea Change program to encourage physicians to transform climate change from an issue dominated by politics and concerns about the future or faraway places to one that matters to every person's health here and now. Aaron serves on the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Environmental Health Executive Committee, and he is chair of the board of directors of the U.S. Green Building Council. We were directed to Aaron by a landmark report that he co-authored with Dr. Eric Chevion titled, How Our Health Depends on Biodiversity. So we're very pleased to have him because when you start Googling biodiversity and extinctions and their impacts on health, you keep seeing Dr. Aaron Bernstein over and over again. So welcome, Aaron. We're so grateful that you could join us today. And did I get all of that right?
Yes, and it's great to be here.
Thank you. Aaron, our last guest from the Center for Biological Diversity talked about what biodiversity is from the environmental perspective. And now you've done a lot of work on biodiversity from the health perspective. So why don't you start us out by talking to us about how human health actually depends on biodiversity, and give us some examples that perhaps everyone or anyone can identify with.
The short is that we must protect nature if we want to protect ourselves. And the past year is case in point. COVID-19 is an emerging infection, the likes of which we have seen before. And we know that these emerging infections, whether it's COVID-19 or SARS or HIV or many of the new infections we hear about in the news, are moving from animals into people because we are changing how we relate to other species on the planet. Most often, as was the case for the Ebola epidemic in West Africa that many will remember some years ago, it's because we're chopping down forests. In other places, it's because of how we're doing agriculture, keeping animals in close quarters, and they are in turn in very close proximity to people. But there's no question that diseases like COVID are more likely today than they were when I was born, and that's because of how we're handling the biosphere. So it's one very clear, immediate example that shows that we have to protect nature, and when we don't do a good enough job there, it affects us. We certainly know from other viruses, including SARS, which was also a coronavirus in 2003. Nipah virus is a virus that first emerged in Malaysia in the 90s, and the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and I could go on. There are many examples where we see, in the case of SARS, how markets, live animal markets, where lots of different species are mixed together, there are lots of people around. These are unnatural consortia of species, and that really increases risk. With Nipah virus in Malaysia, the Nipah virus outbreak happened on one of the largest pig farms, and also resulted because mango trees had been planted near the pig farms, and that lured bats, which are fruit bats in Malaysia, to the farms, and the bats carried Nipah virus transmitted to the pigs transmitted it to people. You look at the emerging infectious events of the last several decades, and 3 out of 4 are infections that move between species. And the underlying drivers are routinely either some kind of land use change like deforestation, some kind of animal husbandry, livestock, so the wet markets, or just large pig farms, and then a whole host of other changes to ecosystems that relate to either agriculture, suburban sprawl, and on and on.
Yeah, and I think there's a word that's used when the organisms go from animal to humans. Is it zoonotic?
Yeah, that's it. We also use the word spillover. So spillover is the idea that a pathogen like a virus or a bacteria spills from an animal into a person, and a zoonosis is just a disease that does that moves from an animal to a person. And what I think is important to realize is that most pathogens that infect people are zoonotic, and that is something that is hard to appreciate because when we get a cold, we think it's because someone sneezed on us, and it probably is. But in terms of the number of different things that can infect people, about 2/3 of them are zoonotic. They actually have life cycles that involve other species, and even when they're not, so a good example of a zoonosis that we see here in New England is Lyme disease, which is the most common vector-borne disease in the United States. But there are other diseases like HIV, which was transmitted from non-human primates into people on several occasions. But the virus, as it is in humans, doesn't really affect primates anymore. But it certainly, is a zoonosis in the sense that it came from wild animals. So it is important to acknowledge that in the emerging infectious realm, we see an even greater percentage of these diseases coming from animals, and particularly wildlife, and that's because we're taking away their homes. We're, putting them in conditions that are not the way that we've related to them for millennia. So it's not entirely surprising to see the signal in the data that we're seeing more of these emergence events.
We are with Dr. Aaron Bernstein with the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, and we'll be right back after this break. And I want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV service. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the green, healthy, and sustainable living authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available for download free online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio as we continue our conversation with Dr. Aaron Bernstein from the Harvard School of Public Health, Harvard Sea Change, as it's called. And he's talking to us about biodiversity, extinctions, and how it affects our health. And again, we're so glad that you could be with us today, Aaron. Before the break, we were talking, and I just want to wrap it up briefly, about how climate change and other effects can affect the functioning of plants and animals in our ecosystem that then have a domino effect that ultimately leads to a health effect.
Yeah, I think it's actually one of the most important ways that changes to the living world matter to us, and it's very apparent with infections. As you were mentioning, Bernice, in Texas, mosquitoes are potentially contributing to outbreaks of infections, and the habitat they have, the other species that might be their predators, really can affect the abundance of mosquitoes. And also, we know the other species that are in the ecosystem. So we know, for example, with West Nile virus, that's a virus that, emerged in the United States in the late 90s. It wasn't here before. And it infects lots of different species, birds and horses. And we see that the diversity of species that are present in any ecosystem can affect the risk of transmission of that disease to people. The same is true of Lyme disease in New England and many other diseases for which there are many animals that can be affected.
So what you're saying, though, is that when there's the opportunity to affect a lot of species of animals, then that significantly ups the opportunity that humans are going to be affected.
Well, I think it's the issue is the diversity of the animals. So
okay.
We can see with COVID, we know that bats can carry the disease and not be infected, show symptoms. But people have said, well, then maybe we should get rid of the bats. Because after all, if there were no bats, we wouldn't have COVID, we wouldn't have Ebola. And that's true, or at least we might expect that could happen. But, of course, the bats have critical roles, as Yara alluded to and you were talking about, outside of their potential risk. And the other side of it is, of course, that if we are more responsible with how we handle ourselves with the rest of nature, we get all the benefits of bats and don't have them as a source of emerging diseases. So I think we just need to be a bit more judicious in how we approach the living world. And, we know enough about nature to see the links that we've been talking about. Do we know everything? No, and that's a big challenge because we're acting, and this is evident in the rates of species decline that we heard about, as if we could, radically transform life on Earth, and it doesn't matter to us at all. But nature is really trying to tell us something here. Nature is telling us that our engagement with the living world is not going well. And it's coming out in these emerging infections. It's coming out in rapid declines of species that are critical to everything from our food systems, like the pollinators and the bats and bees, to our water sources, as you heard about with mussels and watershed ecosystems that are critical for protecting the water we need.
Aaron, tell me, are there particular types or species of extinctions that pose more risk to human health? For example, is extinction of birds more risky than extinction of certain types or species of plants or ocean life or insects?
I'd like to think we knew the answer to that question, Bernice, but I don't think we do. And I think importantly, when it comes to our species welfare, the issues that arise for us happen well before species become extinct. And extinctions are black and white. They're very concrete. But it turns out that well before extinctions happen, the effects on our health are really apparent. And whether that's the insects being regulated by bats, whether it's pollination from bees, whether it's the emerging infections where, species aren't going extinct, but they're losing habitat and declining in number, and on and on. These are things that happen without any species going extinct. And I think that really speaks to one of the things about biodiversity that's often misunderstood is the diversity of life on Earth isn't just about the species. In fact, as far as nature is concerned, species are not the unit of choice. In some ways, ecosystems and genes are far more important to what nature is concerned with. And I think it's important to think about biodiversity on those three levels, namely genes, species, and ecosystems. And they're all critically important to health. And just as a quick example on genes, we get infections with bacteria all the time. And the difference between an infection that I can readily treat with a routine antibiotic and one that I can't is simply a difference in genetic diversity. The same species of bacteria, although what is a species with bacteria is a very difficult thing to get at, is just genetic diversity. And similar things with ecosystems, right? So the ecosystem of New England has become very prone to being good at transmitting Lyme disease. The species are there, but it's a constellation of species and an ecosystem that really matters to whether or not people who live in New England are at risk of getting that disease.
And I imagine that's similar where ours here in North Texas is good at the West Nile. Now, Aaron, I see, too, that researchers are doubling down on their efforts to understand the links between biodiversity and emerging diseases. And I know that you are involved with an exciting initiative that's looking at some of this as well. You all have said that you all are seeking to stop the next pandemic before it starts, or preventing pandemics at the source. And this is very exciting to me. Can you tell us more about this and what was the impetus for this initiative?
Yeah, Bernice, I would expect you and your listeners would agree that nobody wants to go through the past year plus again anytime soon, right? It is clearly an event that none of us would want to go through. And a bunch of colleagues of mine have, got very interested in our response, which is, at the moment focused on vaccination and, protecting ourselves from having the disease spread even more than it has. But we realize that, vaccines and drugs and ventilators aren't really a fix. They're a Band-Aid. In fact, they're the most expensive Band-Aid in human history. This one virus is costing us $10 trillion. And we're spending tens of billions of dollars on the medical package here. But none of that is going to stop the next COVID. And we know, as I was talking about before, we know both the drivers of these emerging infections and just by past experience where they're most likely to emerge. And so when we looked out on the horizon and said, what are we really doing to address this root cause of our problem, the answer is not nearly enough. So we did a little study. We asked the question, how much money would we have to spend to really get at the root cause of this, which are deforestation, the wet markets we talked about, and really being more careful with how we raise animals. And, the price tag is hefty. It's about $20 to $30 billion a year globally. Now, in contrast, we spend about $2 billion a year to protect all the forests of the world. So we're nowhere close even on the deforestation front with this. But then you realize, of course, that for this one virus, it's $10 trillion of, and this isn't in terms of human life, this is in terms of direct economic damage. So the sum is that our salvation comes cheap. I mean, we can't afford not to pay for these prevention actions.
Really briefly, what kinds of things are you all doing? What are your plans? And have you seen any impacts yet?
So there's a coalition of organizations that formed around this idea of preventing pandemics at the source. We call ourselves PPAPs. And it's a group of the leading conservation organizations, including, in no particular order, the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, the Rainforest Alliance, and then the EcoHealth Alliance, which is probably one of the foremost organizations charged with addressing spillover in the world. Right to Health Action, which was started actually with the HIV pandemic, but has moved squarely into the realm of preventing pandemics and is really a health advocacy organization. And Dahlberg Catalyst, which is an organization that's really charged with addressing these kinds of issues, sort of the big challenge we face head on, and our centers at Harvard, and we're working to try and raise this issue in front of policymakers in the United States directly, with the administration, and around the world, because we know that the solution isn't just about what our country chooses to do. We have to work in a coordinated way to address, as one example, forest loss.
Indeed, and thank you for explaining that to us. And we are looking forward to having you back to tell us more about this, because this is a very pervasive issue and really goes beyond biodiversity and extinction. And I think COVID showed us that, how interconnected the world and all its issues and the environment are. We are out of time right now, but Aaron, you have just made us much smarter, and we really appreciate the work that you all are doing there at Harvard CCHAN. And so hopefully you'll be back to join us at some point in the future. Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks for having me, Bernice.
And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day, like yourselves. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up one way or the other to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you, and join us again next week for more Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. Thank you.